Welcome to the North American Trials Council Observers Training video. In this DVD you'll learn to score a national level observed trials. Watch closely. In the following scene you'll note that the observer starts the rider by calling "Rider," blows the whistle as his front axle goes through the gate, and the scoring begins. Scoring stops at the end gate when his front axle passes through that gate.
Expert rider.
Note that the observer called out the rider's class and blew the whistle loudly to start the 1.5 minute time limit. The start marker at the beginning of your section will note that the expert sportsman class either rides the support line or the expert line, in this case the expert line. All of the scoring observers should clearly indicate the rider's score at all times during his ride by using a balled fist for a clean, 1 finger for 1 dab, 2 for 2 dabs, 3 for 3 or more dabs, and a 5 for any failure, accompanied by a loudly blown whistle. Hold these scores until your puncher knows what to give the rider. In the following scenes you'll see many examples of how riders can be assessed dabs and penalty points for a variety of situations. Penalty points are defined in Section 6 of our rules, scoring, where vault definitions for footing is any contact providing support between any part of the rider's body or machine, with the exception of the tires, foot pegs, or skid plate, with the ground or an obstacle such as a tree or rock, etc. Footing can occur either inside or outside the boundary. Here the rider nearly goes through the gate of another class, so observer positioning so you can see the entire section is really important. Here the rider dabs outside the boundary for a 1. In this case the rider rests his handlebar against the rock, using it for support, to get a 1. When the rider dabs and uses his bar for support, that's scored as a 2. When the rider uses any part of his body, his hip, shoulder, knee, head, or whatever, it's counted as a dab. Once the rider has his foot down, he can pivot on that foot and it still only counts as a 1. Whereas when a rider's foot clearly slides along the ground, it counts as a 3. Watch closely here as the rider takes the dab on the wrong side of the bike for a 1. This time the rider gets the same score of 1, even though he's shifting the bike with his right foot. When the rider gets stuck on a rock or a log and takes both feet off the pegs and pushes off, that's a 2. Note here in a similar situation the rider gets a 2. His body goes way back, but his bike does not, so he still only gets a 2. Sometimes the rider will dab twice very quickly, so watch for that. If a rider dismounts his bike to the rear or to the side, it's a 5. When both feet are off the bike on the ground to one side, that's a 5. In the next several scenes we'll see issues with boundary markers. For example, here the rider breaks the ribbon with his foot, but it could be any part of his body. If it breaks the ribbon, that's a 5. As opposed to this situation, he breaks it with the machine, that's also a 5. Sometimes the boundary ribbon is on the ground, and so you need to see ground between the ribbon and the tire to call it a 5. And the same is true here. The rear wheel clearly goes out for a 5. In this example, the rider clearly hops both wheels over the boundary ribbon, and that's a 5. If the machine or the rider displaces a marker, it's a 5. Here the bike displaces a marker for the 5. However, in this case, neither the rider nor the machine directly contacted the marker, so it is not a 5. When the rider hops directly backwards, better set up for an obstacle, that's a 5. Also, when he backs up with his wheels on the ground, it's a 5. The actual width of the section may be reduced by the use of gates, indicated by markers, with an S for support, E for expert, P for pro. Sometimes they'll have a double gate, either for the expert and support or expert and pro. The rider's front axle must go through the gate first, not the rear axle. A rider can only go through his gates. Here he goes through 2 sets of gates, so he gets a 5. When a rider's axle goes through another rider's gate, either way, it's a 5, so this is a 5. The same is true for the rider's rear axle. If it goes through another rider's gate, either way, it's a 5. Sometimes a rider may double back in a section to gain advantage for a different part. If both of his wheels cross both tracks of both wheels, then it is a 5. When the rider's bar touches the ground over 45 degrees from vertical, that's a 5. When the rider stops and puts his foot down and takes his hand off the handlebar, that's a 5. Minders are allowed in the section with the permission of the observers only. They are not allowed to change the section in any way. Here, placing the rock gets the rider a 5. Additionally, if a minder assists the rider, that's a 5 for the rider. When the engine stops while footing or while any other part of the machine except for the tires is used for support without forward motion, that's a 5. When the rider stalls his bike in the section but maintains forward motion or balances on his tires and restarts, he's only counted for the 1 dab he took. Earlier we showed an example of both wheels crossing both tracks for a 5, but in this example the front wheel only crosses both tracks, so therefore it's a clean. Note that if a rider maintains forward motion even while footing and takes his hand off the bar, it's still only a 1. This time the rider stops, takes his hand off the bar, but does not put his foot down, so it's a clean. Note in this example, the rider gets stuck on the ledge, hops around a bit, doesn't put his feet down, takes his hand off the bar, but does not have his feet down, so it's a clean.
Beginning in 2012, we're now going to count toe dabs. So if you watch in this scene, the rider will use toes on both feet to help him push off of this ledge, so that would count as a 2.
If the rider rides on the boundary tape but not over it, it's a clean. Here again, the rider is clean, even though he's on that ribbon. Here the rider stretches the ribbon with the bike, but this is still a clean. It's also okay if a rider stretches the ribbon off of his bike to keep himself clean. Here again, the rider frees up his rear tire from the ribbon without penalty. In this example, the rider floats his rear wheel over a boundary marker for a clean.
Beginning in 2012, any contact by the rider or the machine with a gate marker is a 5. In this case, a rider floats his front wheel over the gate of another class, so that's a 5.
In this case, the rider uses his tire to support and maintain his balance, so there's no penalty. This is a clean. A rider may also lean a foot peg against a rock without penalty. Here the rider scrapes his foot and does not use it for support, so it's a clean. Any part of the rider's body in contact with an obstacle not used for support is a clean. A rider can use a variety of hops and hopping side to side, etc., as long as he doesn't go backwards to set up for an obstacle without penalty. Sometimes when a rider gets too close to an obstacle, he will use a series of legal hopping and nose wheelies to wind up behind, giving him a better spot to start from. In this case, you see the rider gets a couple of feet behind where he was to get through the gate with a clean. In this example, you see the rider's front axle gets clearly outside of the gate, so anything after that point is irrelevant. This is a clean.
Beginning in 2012, if the observer agrees to give a rider a re-ride because of an obstruction, the rider can re-ride the section but would retain any points that he had gained prior to that obstruction.
The rider must be called into the section by the observer. If a rider starts without being called into the section, he gets a 5. In this case, you see he started without the observer signaling him. Unsportsmanlike conduct or profanity by the rider or his minder will result in an extra 5-point penalty. That concludes the training portion of the video. Now you can take these newfound skills and apply them to the following rides. Stop the DVD after each ride and then score it and restart. Here the rider takes 5 dabs, but we only count 3. In this case, the rider goes through gates of 2 different classes, so regardless of his class, it's a 5. Here the rider clearly gets a 2. This is not a dismount, and the bike does not move backwards, so it's only a 2. So this concludes the NATC Observer Training video. Remember to give the rider the benefit of the doubt, but be consistent and fair to all of the riders. You're in charge of your section, and your decisions are final. If you do have any questions, please consult with the NATC sporting steward or your local event organizers.